Hello and welcome to By the Book. I'm your host, Joe Hebert. Today we continue our course on truth, justice, and leadership with a study of St. Thomas Aquinas. In our earlier episodes, we talked about the relationship between faith and reason. And then we've been exploring the concept of happiness. And some of the things that we've learned about happiness are, first of all, happiness is not so much a feeling as a condition. It's a condition of perfection. And that's not a static condition, but rather an active condition. It's an operation, as Aquinas puts it at one point. So it's a certain way of being and acting and living. And it's a way that fulfills our potential or our nature as human beings. So even though we're all different and have different ways of flourishing, there are some universal principles that would explain what it means to be human, what it means to be to perfect our human nature and to achieve this happiness. Now, there's a paradox with human happiness because even though by nature we are designed for a certain kind of life, and this is what brings us happiness, that is something that we can fulfill, but the happiness that we get through simply realizing our human nature through natural means is something that is imperfect and falls short of what we truly desire. So human beings, unlike, say, animals, we actually have a desire for something that goes beyond our own capacity, our own natural capacities. And this is where supernatural grace, faith, and grace come in, because it's possible with the help of God to actually fulfill these desires in a perfect way. And so our nature is paradoxically perfected, not simply by our natural powers, but with the aid of our natural powers by God, supernatural help. So that's something to bear in mind here. And as we get into today's topic, we're going to see that we want to keep both of those things in perspective. First of all, that happiness is an activity that we're doing that fulfills our nature, and so it has that anchor in our nature itself and in our own operations. But it also involves the assistance of someone higher than us and greater than us, and without that assistance, it would not work, at least to the highest level that we truly desire. So if we look at the article that we're going to examine today, whether any good works are necessary that man may receive happiness from God. Even the question itself is already pointing to some interesting nuances here. So we're receiving happiness from God in the sense that by ourselves, we couldn't obtain it. It does not mean that we're passive recipients, and we'll have to make sure we keep that in mind, because we don't want the impression that we're just receiving happiness like somebody's handing us like a new tie for Christmas or something. It's something that we have to actively participate in. Nonetheless, since our efforts by themselves would never suffice, it is ultimately true to say that we're receiving it from God. But then you get the question of good works. And when it's framed in this way, it almost seems like there's some kind of trade-off. Do we have to do something for God? Do we have to give him something before he gives us something? It's like an exchange of gifts or something. And that might make it seem like, hey, God needs our help and we need his help. And at a human level, of course, that kind of thing can happen all the time. I may need something from somebody else that I don't have, and he may need something from me that he doesn't have. So we exchange those things. And clearly that's not going to be an adequate way to look at our relationship with God, because he doesn't need anything from us. So there's no way we can do that kind of an exchange. All those things are going to be important as we go through the objections, and then Aquinas' answer and his reply to the objections. And another thing to say right up front here, this particular issue has become a highly controversial topic ever since Martin Luther and John Calvin took up this and they gave the opposite answer to what Aquinas is going to give. Okay, so from that point on, it has become an infamous, dispute among Christians whether works are necessary for salvation, is usually the way that it's going to be put. Aquinas is writing several centuries before that particular controversy exploded, he himself is quite used to controversy, and he does get involved in the controversies of his own time, and he talks about some from the past. So Aquinas would certainly be ready to enter into that controversy with his arguments here, but just so we realize he is writing long before it became the very particular point of contention that we now see it as being. So Aquinas will answer the question yes. So the objections are saying no. And the first objection is giving us a very strong reason why we might say no to this question. The basic nutshell of this is that God doesn't need anything from us, and he doesn't need our help in the slightest bit to create or provide anything that he wants to provide, including happiness. It would seem that no works of man are necessary that he may obtain happiness from God. For since God is an agent of infinite power, he requires, before acting, neither matter nor disposition of matter, but can forthwith produce the whole effect. So he's making a distinction here between the matter and the disposition of the matter. This is a technical distinction that we could get into, but for our purposes, not terribly important. It's going to track onto, as we see, a couple of different options for how we might access happiness. Okay, but the point here is God can create from nothing. He doesn't need any kind of pre-existing matter to produce something. So it doesn't matter whether anything is there for him, nor does it matter what condition anything might happen to be in. He can always produce any result that he desires to produce without any prior constraints. But man's works, since they are not required for happiness, this is what we saw before, they're not required as the efficient cause thereof. In other words, our actions cannot produce perfect happiness. So perfect happiness is never something that is a consequence of our actions in that sense of cause and effect. Not any kind of direct cause and effect. And so the only logical option left over is a disposition. What would this mean? Are they required as a disposition? In other words, does God need us to be ready for his help, to sort of accept his help, if you will? Is there anything on our part that God needs before he could make us happy? That's the only other option, but he just got done saying God doesn't need either the matter or the disposition of the matter. So just as he doesn't need us to be able to make ourselves happy, he doesn't need us to even be ready for his help necessarily. He can do anything he wants. Therefore, God, who does not require dispositions before acting, bestows happiness without any previous works. Now, this is not Aquinas' position. It's an objection. But as with so many of these objections, it's a very powerful argument. God doesn't need anybody's help for anything, ever. So on what basis would we say that anything is necessary in relationship to something that God's going to do? Now, we'll see there is an answer to that. But when we look at it from this point of view of sort of raw power, since God is omnipotent, it's hard to see what that answer would be. The second objection is similar, but the way that this is put, I think, is very interesting. Just as God is the immediate cause of happiness, so is he the immediate cause of nature. But when God first established nature, he produced creatures without any previous disposition or action on the part of the creature, but made each one perfect forthwith in its species. Therefore, it seems that he bestows happiness on man without any previous works. So this is kind of a variation of what we saw before. God creates from nothing. He doesn't need any help or any pre-existing arrangements to produce his desired results. This is really interesting to me because there's a famous saying by St. Augustine that God created us without us, but he will not save us without us. So that's the answer that actually Aquinas will be answering. But he takes Augustine's very famous formulation of that and he just flips it upside down for the objector. He says, hey, if God created us without us, he must save us without us as well. When in fact, Augustine's point and Aquinas' point is going to be there's something different about the way that God created and the way that he saves. They are analogous in some ways, but in this particular sense, they're almost opposites, and we'll have to see why that is. And then the third objection, again, this is long before Luther, but we can see that Aquinas is well aware that there are passages in Scripture that could seem to argue the other direction. And St. Paul, of course, is one of the sources in Romans. So again, long before Luther, he's looking at Romans and quoting St. Paul, that happiness is of the man to whom God reputes justice without works. So justice here is meant in a very strong sense of the perfection of soul, the all-around virtue or perfection of our nature, which brings happiness. And so St. Paul is saying that this perfection, this happiness, this justice is reputed to us, is somehow given to us in a way without our input, without our works. In fact, it almost this formulation almost has the air of, well, it's not even real. God just treats us as if we are perfect, even though we're not. And that is where, people like Luther are going to go with this. And the objector does something similar here. He says, therefore, no works of man are necessary for attaining happiness. This, apparently clinches it in terms of Scripture, that God is just reputing justice to us, but we don't actually do anything that is worthy of that reputation, so to speak. So what is Aquinas' position? As always, he starts with an authority. Now, in this case, as usual, he could cite many different authorities. He happens to go to the Gospel of John. He happens to go to the Last Supper, when Christ is washing the feet of his disciples, the apostles. And there's a whole symbolism of that, which we're not going to get into right now. It's probably quite significant why Aquinas would look at this. I would mention that, especially if you happen to believe that Scripture supports the idea that works are not necessary, it's actually quite striking how many passages you could look at in the Gospels and other areas of Scripture that formulate it pretty explicitly that works are necessary. And this is just one example, but it's also tied into, in a sense, the establishment of the church and the apostles who are going to go out into the world and spread the gospel when Christ ascends into heaven. And so he washes their feet, and of course they're struggling to understand what the message is exactly. And part of what he tells them is this: if you know these things, if you know what I'm trying to teach you with my actions, you shall be blessed if you do them. And Aquinas says, therefore, happiness is obtained through works. Because blessed means supremely happy. You will be supremely happy if you do what I am doing, what I am teaching you to do with my actions. So the gospel is something we do. Obviously something we believe, matter of faith, but it's also something we do. And Aquinas goes to one of the great examples of that from the Lord's mouth himself, saying that this is what I'm trying to give to you is an example, a pattern for how to live and how to achieve happiness through the works that you do, basically. Now, the answer here is going to be somewhat complex. We've already seen that in an absolute sense, God does not need any prior dispositions because he's omnipotent. But in a certain sense, there is a limit to God's omnipotence. And it's not a limit of weakness. It's a limit of, there are certain things that we could formulate, which if you could do, it would not be a sign of power. It would be a sign of weakness. For example, contradicting yourself. Can God contradict himself? No, not because he is inferior, but because he's superior. And it's bad to contradict yourself. Therefore, God could never do anything that's bad, basically, right? Anything that itself would be a weakness or an imperfection or a defect, God cannot do those things. Also, God is not somehow capable of committing absurdities. So, God can create, for example, out of nothing. So God could take, absolutely nothing and say, let there be a pig, and there would be a pig. So he doesn't need, other pigs to reproduce or something. He could make a pig out of nothing. But could God, create a pig and say this is an elephant? Uh, that wouldn't make any sense. I mean, it's not a detraction of God to say no, God can't make a pig be an elephant at the same time, because that would be a contradiction. It would just be stupid. So God is not stupid. So that's part of it's not the whole answer, but this is a first step of the answer that we're going to see. And then he's going to go to some further complexities that we want to look at. But starting with, okay, we talked about a pig. Let's talk about happiness, because that's our topic. What is happiness? God could not make something that is not happiness and say, well, that is happiness. Okay? If he's going to make us happy, we have to actually be happy, right? If, otherwise it'd be nonsense for him to say, okay, I'm reputing that you're happy. I mean, what good would that be? I'm going to pretend like you're happy, but you're not really. So this is what Aquinas says. Rectitude of the will, as stated above, is necessary for happiness. It's a very shorthand, but we have to actually know and do what is good. Know and desire and do what is good. Rectitude of the will. Since it is nothing else than the right ordering of the will to the last end, and it is therefore necessary for obtaining the end, just as the right disposition of matter in order to receive the form. So, in other words, if God made something that, looked like an elephant and had this huge nose, trunk, and, all this stuff, and said, hey, it's a pig, it doesn't have the right, dispositions. Likewise, if our will is not right, it's not aimed at the last end, then we're not happy. And there's no way that we can be happy without having that reality of a rightly ordered soul. So going on from this, it is therefore necessary for obtaining the end. But this does not prove that any work of man need precede his happiness. For God could make a will having a right tendency to the end, and at the same time attaining the end, just as sometimes he disposes matter and at the same time introduces the form. So part of what Aquinas is getting at, this is transitioning to the next point, God doesn't usually do that, though. How many times have we ever seen that God created a pig out of nothing, or that he created anything out of nothing? The beginning, yeah, because there was nothing else. But after he created out of nothing, he doesn't frequently do that again. He lets things in nature take their course. There are miracles once in a while, but those are exceptional, right? So that's already getting us into the second part of the answer. But the first part of the answer is just like God could create a pig out of nothing, but only if he actually made a pig. It would still have to have the matter and would still have to have the form. If it didn't have the matter and the form, it wouldn't be a pig, and he wouldn't have created a pig. So man could just make us God could just make us happy without any prior disposition on our part. But in doing so, he would be giving us that disposition. If we didn't get that disposition, then we wouldn't be happy. But once we have that disposition, then we are working, we are operating in a right way. So in this sense, works are absolutely essential to happiness and salvation, which ultimate happiness is the same thing as salvation. They're absolutely necessary, because whenever God gives that to us, in whatever way he gives it to us, then we have it, and that is an operation. He's giving us an operation. So we are working by definition once he has done that. But that's step one. Step one is, even if he just gave it to us with absolutely no prior disposition on our part, after that point we would be operating in a way that makes us happy. But of course, now he refers to something that is extremely significant, and this comes up throughout the Summa. What God can do and what he does are not the same thing, right? God did not have to create anything at all. He could have gone for eternity with no creation whatsoever, but he didn't do that. And there's no looking back, right? God created, and we know, like Aquinas says at one point, well, God could just wipe out the cosmos if he wanted to. He could just say, I'm tired of it, I don't want it to exist. But does he do that? Aquinas doesn't even ask, will he do that? He asks, does he do that? Because God's eternal. And he says, no, God doesn't do that. That is not the divine will. That is not the divine wisdom. That is not the divine goodness that we know. we know both by nature and by revelation that that is not the way God is. God chose to create the universe in his infinite wisdom, and he's not going to change his mind and say, whoops, never mind. I don't need this universe. Let's just get rid of it. So the same thing applies throughout the universe, the whole nature of things in the universe. God made it that way. So God doesn't absolutely need things to be a particular way, but he chooses to make things a particular way from his wisdom, and his wisdom has an order to it. It's intelligible. He is an intelligent being, and we're intelligent beings, infinitely inferior to him, but still we can see the order, we can see the orderliness of what he does and the wisdom of what he does. To some extent, we can appreciate that. And we can see that this means God is not some kind of a random agent. He's not just flailing around doing, even though he's omnipotent, he's not. Imagine if you had an omnipotent being, but who's just randomly doing stuff, making things, eliminating things. I mean, anything could happen at any point. That's not the world we live in. That's not the world God created. He didn't want to, and it wouldn't have been good for him to do that. There would have been no point to it, really. So the order of divine wisdom demands that it should not be thus. Why would God want to take some, horrific, criminal and just say, boom, okay, now you have a perfect will and you're perfectly happy? What would be the wisdom of that? What would be the justice of that? What would be, the beauty of that? Now, if somebody repents all of a sudden, and we have examples of that, well, that's a beautiful thing, right? That's an incredible thing. Somebody who was so corrupt, and then they have some kind of enlightenment and they realize they're wrong, and then God showers them with graces. Well, that's great, but why would God want to be rewarding sin per se, for example, or just completely ignoring that? It wouldn't be in the order of divine wisdom. The order of divine wisdom demands that it should not be thus. For as is stated on the heavens, of those things that have a natural capacity for perfect good, one has it without movement, some by one movement, some by several. So different things within the universe have different degrees of complexity. Some of them just are a certain way, and it's pretty much automatic. Some of them, there's processes they're going through before they get to, and obviously we know that living things are among those who go through very complex processes. So whether it's an acorn turning into an oak, that doesn't happen overnight. And if you just compare the acorn to the oak, you would be, how could that ever happen, right? It doesn't even seem possible. It's a tremendous transformation, but it takes time and it takes many different steps before it's going to get there. And same thing with human beings, of course. We go through from embryo to old man. We go through many different stages, and if you include heaven in this, then that's there's even further steps that get you to that. Now, to possess the perfect good without movement belongs to that which has it naturally, and to have happiness naturally belongs to God alone. So this is, I talked about, say, like, criminals just suddenly being just and happy with no contrition in between. That would be against natural order. But Aquinas says, really, for anybody to automatically be happy without any input of their own is something that is appropriate only for God, because God in his essence is happiness. He is perfection. It's appropriate that he has no process. He didn't have to get there. He didn't have to work on it at all. But for any other being, even the angels, they are much simpler than we are in a sense. They're only spirits, and they're so much more powerful than we are that they didn't have to think through a lot of stuff. But even them, he gave a choice. They had to make a choice. And it wasn't going to be automatic. And that's why some of them chose against God and became devils. But for human beings, of course, it's not even that simple. We have lives where we could be going in different directions at different points in our lives. And there's a longer term sort of process that we're going through. So he concludes the argument like this: therefore, it belongs to God alone, not to be moved towards happiness by any previous operation. For all other creatures, if they're going to be happy, it's going to take work. That's basically what he's saying, and it's because, again, the wisdom of the divine order. Only for God is it appropriate to just automatically be happy. For any other being who's capable of happiness, it's appropriate that they should have to work at it. Now, since happiness surpasses every created nature, no pure creature can becomingly gain happiness without the movement of operation whereby it tends thereto. So this is perhaps a little bit obscure formulation, but one thing it suggests to me is that we might think that because happiness surpasses our nature, therefore our own work is superfluous. But Aquinas is saying it's really the opposite. Precisely because we're getting something beyond our own nature, it's appropriate that we should have to make an effort for this. Because really, it would be kind of perverse if things that are within our power, but we still have to work at it. But things that are beyond our power, we don't have to work at all. So the fact that it's beyond our power and we need God's help for it doesn't mean that God is just going to give it to us with no effort on our part. Okay, that would be as if God doesn't really get, think about parents and children. You could do all kinds of things for your young little children, but if you're halfway decent parents, you realize the kids have to learn how to do stuff. So at some point, you're going to stop doing everything for them all the time, and you're going to make them do some stuff on their own. It's not because you couldn't do it. In fact, a lot of times, you're letting them do things and it takes forever and they're not doing a great job, but you're doing that because it's good for them, right? They need to go through that. And do we think God is less wise about this? Less able to see that it's fitting to allow people to work at something that's such a great reward that they're aiming at? So we're talking about here not what God can do in the sense of raw power. We're talking about what God does in his wisdom. What is consistent with divine wisdom? And it's consistent with divine wisdom to allow each creature to achieve its perfection in the way that's appropriate for that creature. Even if it takes God's help, he's not going to cancel out the nature of that creature with his help. He's going to help it in a way that's appropriate to its nature. So the angel, as mentioned before, who's above man in the natural order, obtained happiness according to the order of divine wisdom by one movement of a meritorious work, as was explained earlier. So the word merit is coming in here now, and we'll discuss that in a moment. But for angels, it was very simple. There was only one thing they had to do because of their nature. They don't dither around. They have such a powerful mind that it only took one choice for them to decide for or against God. Whereas man obtains it by many movements of works, which are called merits. And it's based on our nature. We're lower than the angels. Our reason is weaker. It takes many, many years for us to even really learn how to reason, but then we continue to make mistakes. We need time to think things through. We need trial and error. We need to go through many different experiences to get to any particular destination, particularly if we're talking about growth in perfection and virtue. Wherefore, according to Aristotle, happiness is the reward of works of virtue. So, of course, Aristotle is talking about natural happiness, the imperfect happiness that we can obtain through our natural powers. So it would almost seem to be a mismatch here because Aquinas is talking about perfect happiness that we can only achieve with God's help. But he's linked those things. This is, I think, probably one of the most important things for us to look at in this course because it's not a theology course. So we are particularly trying to look at the implications for ethics and politics of these Christian ideas. And what we're seeing here is that in Aquinas' view, the classical Christian view, there is no contradiction or antagonism between the natural order by which we achieve happiness as a reward of virtue and the divine order, even though this supernatural happiness has to come through a gift of God. He doesn't give us those gifts in a way that disrupts the order that he himself created in nature. He wants it to build on nature, as Aquinas said earlier, not to contradict nature. So that's his answer. Now let's look at how he deals with the objections. Now, the objection had said that our works don't cause happiness, true happiness. This had already been established. Aquinas had already argued this earlier. And God doesn't need our dispositions. He doesn't need us to be ready. So therefore, nothing is necessary on our part. Now, Aquinas, he doesn't get into the nuances here in his reply. But if we look at what his answer has been, we could see two things. Our works don't in themselves, by our natural powers, our works do not produce this happiness. But happiness itself is an operation. And if we are going to be happy, we will be working in a way that makes us happy. And if that requires divine assistance, it doesn't mean that we're not working. Okay, so that's the first part of the answer. The second part has to do with the dispositions, which is that does God wait for us to be disposed? Yes, not because he needs us to be disposed, but because that is the wise and good way for him to behave. Just like parents who do everything for their children are not helping their children to grow up. A God who would just do everything for us, it just doesn't fit with the way that he designed us. Okay, so works are necessary, therefore, to man in order to gain happiness. But it's not on account of the insufficiency of divine power. That's a red herring. We're going in the wrong direction if we think, well, God doesn't need these things from us. It's not about what he needs. It's about what is wise and good for us. So it's not on account of the insufficiency of divine power, which bestows happiness, but that the order of things be observed. So we see here, just like with Socrates, the idea of cosmos, order, for Aquinas and his philosophy and his theology, this is a supremely important concept. Because even though God has the raw ability to do all kinds of stuff, God is reasonable and he's good. He understands that there's an order. He himself ultimately is that order. But in terms of creation, the order that's in things, he put it there, and he sees the goodness of it, and he does not act against it. He doesn't mess it up. We mess it up all the time, of course, but God doesn't mess it up. So he's not going to act in such a way that contradicts the order of things, which is his creation and reflects his intelligence and his benignity. Now, his response to the second objection is a little bit longer and a little bit more complicated. But remember, the second objector had said, well, in the beginning, God created everything from nothing. So why would his salvation require any arrangements? And his response, God produced the first creatures so that they are perfect forthwith without any previous disposition or operation of the creature, because he instituted the first individuals of the various species, that through them nature might be propagated to their progeny. So, in other words, creation had to start somewhere. It had to start from nothing, because before it existed, it didn't exist. So that was a necessary starting point. But from that time forward, that is not how things work. Pigs don't generally just come out of nothing. They come from their parents, who are pigs. And everything else in nature is following this order of nature. Again, miracles aside, which are exceptional. And if we studied, miracles, we could look into how do they usually work. But we could probably hypothesize here that Aquinas is going to say that miracles are not meant to contradict nature either. They're meant to enhance it in certain ways for certain purposes. But basically, we're getting back to this idea of order. The order of nature is something that God created, and he means for it to work in the way that he created it. In like manner, and so he's going to analogize this to salvation. In like manner, because happiness was to be bestowed on others through Christ, who is God and man, who, according to St. Paul, had brought many children into glory. Therefore, from the very beginning of his conception, his soul was happy without any previous meritorious operation. So there is a analogy to creation from nothing. When Christ becomes man, there is a creation of a human nature for Christ, which has a perfect will and perfect happiness from nothing. In other words, not that he didn't have a human parent, but that perfection in him was not transmitted from human parents. It was placed directly in him by God, by himself, in creating that human nature for himself. And so there's a kind of creation from nothing that's going on there of this happiness. But just like with the creation of the animals, they're then to propagate. Christ has that happiness in his human nature that's created from nothing, but then it's transmitted. As you can say in a minute, it's transmitted through things like baptism. Okay, so there was no prior meritorious operation, and it went straight to the finish, if you will, to perfect happiness. But this is peculiar to Christ. For Christ's merit avails baptized children for the gaining of happiness, though they have no merits of their own. So in other words, for a temporary time, human beings can simply just share in the merits of Christ, even though they have none of their own. But then as we grow up and we make our own choices and decisions, then by this order of divine wisdom, it's appropriate for us to either cooperate with those graces and those merits of Christ or not. And if we don't, of course, then it's going to be appropriate that we're losing the way towards that perfect happiness. But if we do, then it will be appropriate for us to make it there in the end. So there's a lot we could say about this nature of merit, of the way that Aquinas is looking at it. But, once again, if we think too simplistically and we think, well, merit means that we simply earn something in the sense that we do something which is capable of producing or worthy of these particular results. So in other words, if I can merit happiness, it means that I can do things that produce happiness directly, or things that are worth some kind of bargain of saying, hey, if I do this, it's worth, giving me this happiness. But that neither of those is the case. Our actions cannot directly yield this happiness by themselves, nor are they worthy that we're trading something with God that he needs or something like that. So, but Aquinas uses the term merit nonetheless. And he even uses the word reward in citing Aristotle. So we have to look at this very precisely, what he is saying. He's not saying that it's a merit or a reward in the sense that either directly produces or is of equivalent value for trade for what we're getting. But he's saying in the order of divine wisdom, it is what is appropriate for us given our nature. God wants to see, it's like the widow's mite. The widow's mite, the actual monetary value of that mite was negligible. Okay, from a financial point of view, she gave practically nothing. And it's that temple where she gave that mite is not going to be repairing things based on, it's not going to pay for major repairs on the building. Okay, so it's objectively a very small thing, but God holds it to be a great value because she gives everything she has. That's the way I think you have to look at this concept of merit. Is not as we actually capable of doing things that are worthy of heaven, but what is appropriate for us in terms of disposing ourselves for this gift that God is willing to give us. he expects us to dispose ourselves appropriately relative to who we are as human beings. Now, the third objection is important, particularly because it is interpreting one of the scriptures that is often cited on this point. So remember, St. Paul had said that happiness belongs to the man to whom God reputes this justice without works. And Aquinas says the apostle is speaking of the happiness of hope. So what does he mean, the happiness of hope? He's not talking about the happiness of heaven, actually being happy like we will in heaven. He's talking about the happiness on the way there. In other words, the beginnings of that, realizing we're on the path to that. So that's just how he interprets that particular statement of St. Paul. This happiness of hope, being placed on the right path and having some sense that we're on the right path, is bestowed on us by sanctifying grace, which is not given on account of previous works. So there's nothing that we could do to earn that or to make it, necessary for God to give us that. But he says grace is not a term of movement. So grace, being the gift or the assistance of God, is not the end, because we'd seen before, if we're going to be happy, we're going to be operating at a level of perfection. That's what it means to be happy. So the help that we're getting to do that is not the end, it's the means. God gives us grace to enable us to work in that way. And I think perhaps this is the ultimate point of the whole thing, because first of all, the essence of happiness is an operation, so there's just no way of even conceptualizing that we could be saved without works, in the sense that salvation is a kind of work that we're doing. But then you could say, well, we can't do that work without help. But here's I think the fundamental point. If we're doing something with help, we are doing that thing. It does not mean we're not doing it. If I'm doing something with help, it means that I am doing it. Because if I weren't doing it, nobody would be helping me to do it. I wouldn't be doing it at all. They would be doing it for me. So it's a difference between help or just substitution of doing something for somebody. If somebody says, "Oh, I'm having trouble with my computer," blah, blah, I could just say, "Hey, get out of here, leave the room, let me fix it for you." This is totally hypothetical. I would just ruin it. But I could just say, "Let me do it. Just get out of here. Let me do it." Or if they're trying to do it and I kind of walk through it with them and I point something out and I say, "Oh, try this," and they try it and it works. That's a big difference, right? They're actually doing it, although I'm helping them with it. And so that's what we're talking about here. Grace is not a term of movement. It isn't the actual happiness itself. Happiness is the term. It's the end. It's the operation by which we become perfect. But rather, grace is the principle of the movement that tends towards happiness. So grace is a means, a movement towards that thing. And without that grace, well, none of our works would suffice. And that's why he says that sanctifying grace, which is putting us on that path, is something that we cannot merit in that sense, because prior to having that sanctifying grace, we don't have the help of God. And therefore, nothing we do is going to be meritorious towards heaven. But once we have the sanctifying grace, then the things that we're doing are our own actions, but they're not only our own actions. They are us with the help of God. And so the things that we're doing can be meritorious in a completely different way. And as we saw, all of that is necessary in the sense that, first of all, it is necessary to the essence of what happiness is. The whole concept of happiness means that we do have to be operating. And it's also necessary in the sense of this is what is fitting given the order of things that God created and the nature, particularly of human beings and the way human beings live. This is the way that is appropriate and wise and good for us to grow in virtue and in merits towards that final operation of happiness.